Good morning. This is the Keeping It Real Sunday School class from Cornerstone Baptist Church in Richland, Missouri. I'm Dr. Max Thornsberry, and I am the teacher, and my wife Brenda will be reading the scriptures for us this morning. We are continuing our study about Abram, soon to be Abraham, and today we're going to look at how Abraham dealt with conflict. Now, I didn't think this was a really interesting story, but once you get into all the details and a little bit of the history, you can really begin to see the setup here for what is going to happen to Lot and what's going to happen at Sodom and Gomorrah, what's going to happen to Lot's wife on the plains of Mamre when Christ, pre-incarnate Christ, and two angels are going to come to Abram and explain to them, Sarai and Abram, that they're going to have a child. That's when Sarai laughs and says, I'm 90 years old, I can't have a child. And with God, all things are possible. So let's get started this morning, Brenda, at Genesis 13 and read verses 5 through 8, please.
And Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. And the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. And there was a strife between the herdsmen of Abram's cattle and the herdsmen of Lot's cattle. And the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelt then in the land. And Abram said unto Lot, Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdsmen and thy herdsmen, for we are brethren.
Now you remember that Lot is Abraham's nephew. His older brother Haran had passed away, and Abram had taken Lot under his wing. And in the process, he had allowed Lot to accumulate a lot of wealth. When they came out of Egypt, you remember, Pharaoh sent him out of Egypt after tricking him about Sarah being Abraham's sister. And the Egyptians had paid Abraham a lot of tribute to take Sarah as a diplomatic wife, and Pharaoh let him keep it all. And they come out of Egypt with a lot more than they went in. Well, when they got back to the area where they were there wasn't enough grass or water to support both of them. And there was conflict. And Abraham is trying to deal with this conflict in a very humble and a very gracious manner. As a matter of fact, he gives Lot first choice. And the conflict wasn't really between Lot and Abraham. I think Lot thought he had the best deal on earth there, you know. He stayed with his uncle and basically get all of the good things that came from God blessing Abram. But there was conflict between those taking care of the livestock. And I can see that, can't you? I can see it very clearly. You got all the Lot's cattle branded with an L and all Abraham's cattle branded with an A. And they're out there trying to graze the same pasture, and it's just not going to work. There's not enough water. There's not enough grass. And we get a pretty good idea here of how Abraham has decided to deal with strife. The lesson writer said that many people avoid conflict at all costs. In other words, they let people walk over the top of them. They don't assert themselves. They don't look out for themselves or their family. And then there are others that, kind of like me, to some extent, like conflict. Because conflict builds character. And you like to deal with how you're going to address it. Well, this wasn't the case with Abram. Abram didn't want the conflict, and he has done everything he can in a very gracious manner to deal with it. Now, this conflict's not new to this family. You're going to find that Jacob had conflict with Laban, his father-in-law. You're going to find that Isaac, two sons, Jacob and Esau, had conflict. Is life possible without conflict?
I would say no. If you have a life without conflict, you probably never leave your house, or turn on the television, or you just sit in a room by yourself, or go on a mountaintop and sit by yourself.
Life is full of conflict, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Right now we're in conflict with our own government. We're in conflict with tyranny. We're in conflict with blackmail. Blackmailing, you get a vaccine, you lose your job. The list could go on. Life is full of conflicts, and it's going to be that way to the day we die. You're not going to be able to avoid conflict, but you should have a biblical manner in how to deal with it. Christ told us, and the Apostle Paul followed up with it, that we should deal with conflict in Christian circles amongst ourselves, not take it to the judges or the magistrates that either leave it alone or address it before the church. Not much of that's ever done. I only saw it done one time and it didn't come out very good. So the practicality of doing what Christ and the Apostle Paul has asked us to do doesn't really match the reality. And in our day and time, we have a legal system, and that's where most conflicts end up. We're not to let people walk over the top of us. We are not to be milk toast in society. Christ sure was not milk toast. And he made it very evident, you whitewashed tombs, pretty and white on the outside and full of dead man's bones and everything that's unclean on the inside, as he addressed the Pharisees. He didn't back down from conflict, but he addressed it truthfully. And that's one thing you have to do. You have to address it truthfully. I did learn early in life that the principle of the thing is not always worth the effort in the conflict. Abraham was completely within his rights. Said, this promise is made to me, Lot, not you. You take your bunch and get out of here.
He could have, yes.
Very easily. But he chose not to let the principle of the thing overrule his gracious nature, and the outcome is not going to be good for Lot, as we read on. It's interesting, you'll notice in this, now, God has promised him this land, Brenda. We read that last week. And it says here in verse 7, and there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's cattle and the herdsmen of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite, which I think is probably better translated parasite, dwelleth then in the land. They weren't there by themselves, were they? God's going to show him a little, look east, west, north, and south, far as you can see, this is going to be yours. But it wasn't theirs now. I would like you to turn to Hebrews chapter 11, Brenda, and read verse 1. And if you can, keep your hand there, or finger in there, because we're going to look at another verse out of Hebrews 11 as we get further along in this lesson.
What verse in 11?
Hebrews 11:1.
Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen.
Would you say this is a perfect example of that verse?
Well, yes, because he's been promised, and he has faith it's going to happen, but it doesn't look like it is right now.
Doesn't look like it at all, does it? Doesn't look like it at all. It's pretty easy for us to lose sight of the fact that our promises are primarily in the future. And we do have promises here. We have promises given to us in Deuteronomy chapter 8 if we serve the Lord. But we also addressed some promises last week that I don't like. Or the Apostle Paul told Timothy that those who seek to live righteously in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. Well, that's a truth that I don't like, but it is a fact. We also studied last week where the Apostle Paul told Timothy that we'll have problems and issues and difficulties if we really try to present the gospel. The world is not going to agree with us, not going to bless us, not going to love us. They're going to be in total opposition to us. Those are two promises I don't like. So let's continue reading, Brenda. If you would go to Genesis 13 and read 9 through 11, please.
Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if thou depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes, and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other.
It's quite interesting that the Bible leaves this symbolism that Lot journeyed east, and he did. Where they are located there in the central part of the highlands, south of Jerusalem. We're going to see in Hebron, it's a It's some miles south of Jerusalem. Hebron's actually the tallest point in all of Israel. It's 3,000, or in southern Israel anyway, it's 3,000 some high. So you could get up on that Mount Hebron and you could see in every direction. We're going to see how God addresses this to Abraham here in a few minutes. So they're up here on this high ground and they're looking out, and Lot looks out and he says, by golly, that Jordan River looks pretty good. It's got water coming down all the time. There's a fertile plain on each side of it. It's being, we now know from archaeological evidence, it was being irrigated. What he's not seeing here is the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. Aha! And notice that it says, and he journeyed east. He would have to go east to go there. There's a lot of symbolism in that journey east. Do you know what direction the angel drove Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden?
East.
East. Do you know after the flood that people moved south and east and ended up in Babel, or what we call Babylon, and built the Tower of Babel, and then God scattered them throughout the land? This going east is a symbolism for choosing the world over God's direction. And we don't see Lot getting down on his knees and said, Lord, what should I do? We don't see Lot saying, Uncle Abraham, you know, you should have first choice of all this ground. God's given you this blessing. I'll take what's left. Don't see any of that attitude from Lot. Lot just looks out and says, I'm going to take the best for me. The world's got to offer it, and I'm going to take it. And isn't that the case with life many times? The world seeks to entice us to take what it has, and in reality, in the long run, it's going to be and will be destruction for our lives. We see it in drugs. We see it in all kinds of perverse activity and sin, that it is enticing, isn't it? It can be enticing, but it leads to destruction. It leads to destruction. We had a discussion the other day about how bad venereal disease is getting in our society today because a complete lack of morality is related to sexual activity. And this is an adult Sunday school lesson, but it just goes layer after layer after layer deep, because once you march into a certain arena, it just becomes easier to go further and further and further into the depth of it. The next thing you know, you're like Lot, you're destroyed. Lot thought, you know, he's a godly man, and we read in James here not too long ago, and in Peter as well, 1 Peter, that he was called a godly man because he believed in God, but he had allowed himself to be completely overtaken by the world. When God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, you remember Abraham argued with him, don't you? Argued with the Lord Jesus Christ. So what if there's 40 righteous men? What if there's 30? What if there's 20? What if there's 10? Well, for the sake of 10 righteous men, I'll spare Sodom and Gomorrah. There was one. One. And the angels let him out. And he went to this town, Zorah, which is a small town. They wanted him to go into the hills. The angels did, but he chose this little small town, Zorah, which is mentioned here in that reading. So notice that when Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as he sees this, and he says, this is like the Garden of Eden. It's like the garden of the Lord, without any regard to what happened to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, right? And he also says it's like the land of Egypt. Well, it was. Egypt's all of their land on the northern coast of Africa, watered by the Nile River, new soil brought down every year, and the floods, a phenomenal area. The crescent, Fertile Crescent up in the Tigris and Euphrates River, going all the way around, and then you have Egypt stuck out here in the middle of the desert. Just absolute phenomenal fertility of the soil, and water available at all times. That Nile River drains way up into the central part of Africa, all the way to the north coast. Did he not remember what happened to them in Egypt?
I don't know. Well, it's like socialism. It's never, ever, ever worked. But this time, if we try it,
I'll make it work. I'll make it work. Yeah, I'll make it work. Well, anyway, I think there's great symbolism in that, and that he is not recognizing that being the kind of person he is, selfish, not seeking God's direction, taking the best and leaving Abraham what's left, but recognizing in his own mind this is like the Garden of Eden, this is like Egypt, and not remembering what happened in both of those locations. And Lot marches off to the plains of Jordan, and as we all know, he eventually ends up in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, and it's not a pretty picture. So, Brendan, would you turn to Philippians chapter 2 and read verses 3 through 4, please?
Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than themselves. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others.
Now that's the Apostle Paul addressing the Philippians. He's also the one that says every man is given a measure of faith, and one ought not think too highly of himself simply because they've chosen the Lord. Every man has the right to choose the Lord. He loves using this kind of language. And yet the Apostle Paul dealt with strife all through his life, all through his ministry, and he was no pushover. Guarantee you that. Apostle Paul was not a pushover. He was not a milquetoast in any way, shape, or form. And he proved that in Athens, didn't he? When he was up there at the Epicureans. In him we live and move and have our being. So he wasn't afraid to stand up for what he believed, and we should not be either. And I'd like you to go to 1 John 4:18. I think we read this here not too long ago in our lessons, but 1 John chapter 4, verse 18.
There is no fear in love, but perfect love casteth out fear, because fear hath punishment. He that feareth is not made perfect in love.
Now, there's a lot of things to fear in this life, isn't there, Brenda?
Yes, if you think too hard, you can find a lot of things.
You could be so afeared that you just stayed home. I know people that are doing that right now. They're not doing anything. They're not getting out of the house. They're not leaving the farm. They're staying. They're scared to death. They're wearing a mask everywhere they go. Others like us just march right on out there and do our thing, hoping the Lord will protect us, having faith that He will protect us. Not that we're any greater, we ought not think too highly of ourselves, but our whole concept and thinking is different. We're not going to live in fear, right?
No.
God did not give you a spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind, right?
Correct.
Can't live in fear. You can't have the love that God has in store for you, or love for other Christians, or love for your family, your wife, or your children, or your grandkids, anybody else if you live in fear. My daughter is one that always says, I'm not going to live in fear. I did teach her one thing anyway.
Yeah, just one.
I taught her one thing. So I told you we're going to look at another verse in Hebrews chapter 11, Brent. I want you to read verse 10. I'll let you get your thumb out of there. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 10.
For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God.
And then with that in our mind, I want you to read verse 14 through 18 of Genesis chapter 13.
And the Lord said unto Abram, after Lot was separated from him, Lift up now thine eyes, and look from the place where thou art northward, and southward, and eastward, and westward. For all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then he shall see thy seed also be numbered. Arise, walk through the land in the length of it, and in the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee. Then Abram removed his tent, and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord.
Now this was an area that was already occupied, Brenda. It was already occupied by other people. People that actually became Abraham's allies when they went against the kings that had come up against Salem, and helped Abraham to recover Lot, his family, and all of the riches. And that's the first time we saw in the Bible where a worshiper of God paid tithes unto Melchizedek, a pre-incarnate Christ, a form of a pre-incarnate Christ. This plains of Mamre, or oaks of Mamre, is going to be very important, because this is where Abraham is going to meet pre-incarnate Lord Jesus Christ and the two angels that are going to Sodom and Gomorrah. This is where Abraham literally sits down with the pre-incarnate Lord Jesus Christ and feeds him butter and cheese and milk and honey and kills the fatted calf for him. So Jesus was not a vegetarian.
He was not.
Nor
a vegan.
Nor a vegan. That's right. And again, he is led up here on Hebron. He can look, basically in any direction. And God says it's all going to be yours. Mm-hmm. And not only is it going to be yours, but your descendants are going to be unnumbered. They'll be as the dust of the... he later on tells him, look up in the sky. Can you number those stars? No. Well, that's what your descendants are going to be like. You're going to be unnumberable. Unnumbered. Innumerable.
Yeah.
He doesn't even have a kid yet.
I know.
He doesn't even have a descendant. Mm-mm. How's that going to happen?
Well, only God knows.
Substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're getting older by the day. All the way up. Now, he was 75 roughly when he came up out of Egypt. So 75 to 90 before all this occurs, where Christ comes to him on the plains of Mamre and makes this promise, he don't even have a kid. Now, there's some things happened in between there that aren't very pretty.
Mm-hmm.
He had already decided he was going to make Eleazar his descendant because he had periods of doubt. Sarah had sent in Hagar, and he'd had a son by her. Ishmael was 8 or 9 years old when Isaac was born. Boy, it's pretty easy to get discouraged, even if you know what the truth is going to be, isn't it?
Oh, yes.
We could say all these great things about the faith of Abraham, but he was a man, mm-hmm. like as until we were, mm-hmm. as we are, and he had periods of doubt. A lot of time between 75 and so Sarai was 65 to 90. That, I believe that's correct. That's 25 years, isn't it? Mm-hmm. That later, mm-hmm. 25 years later, that Christ comes and says, Sarah's going to have a baby, and he's going to be your descendant. He had one son of promise. Mm-hmm. That's it, Isaac. Mm-hmm. And Isaac had Jacob and Esau, and Jacob had 12 tribes of Israel, and now we're on the road.
Yeah.
Now we're on the road. The line of the tribe of Judah. Mm-hmm. The name shall never die. The tribe shall never die. And boy, Judah wasn't any good guy in a lot of respects. That God he could see what was going to happen. He knew what was going to happen. And it wasn't until Moses brought the nation of Israel back, and they went through the wilderness for 40 years, and Joshua led them across the Jordan River, that all of this is ever going to come to pass. This is hundreds of years in the future. Now, he tells Abram that that's going to happen. We'll see in a lesson or two that it's going to, God just kind of rounds it off, said they're going to spend 400 years in Egypt in bondage, but it's actually 430. It wasn't that God didn't know it was 430. He just kind of rounding it off, so to speak. What?
Well, I think Moses wandered around for all that time because he didn't have a GPS. Refused to
recalculating.
Yeah.
Recalculating.
Refused to ask
There's
for
a reason
directions.
why they wandered around out there, I can tell you that. Because of their lack of faith. So all of them died, except for Joshua and Caleb. Well, let's talk a little bit about some things relating to conflict. I want to read you 3 quotes from Thomas Jefferson, our 3rd president. And man that I highly admire, agriculturalist, had faults in his life. He owned slaves, wasn't near perfect by any means. He'd spent years in Europe as our envoy to France. He wasn't unfamiliar with what took place in Europe. One of the quotes that I really like that he made is, "When we get piled upon one another in large cities, as in Europe, we shall become as corrupt as Europe." Now, Lot looked to go to the cities when he should have stayed agricultural and rural and on the plains. If he'd have stayed out on the plains and been agricultural in his approach, and in his lifestyle. What is it about the city that draws people to it like a fly to a lamp? And is that not absolutely true? I'll read you another quote here in a minute that is perfectly true. Most of our crime occurs in the cities. Most prostitution occurs in the cities. Most sexual selling of children into sex trade occurs in the cities. We could just go on and on. On and on. There are places in St. Louis and Kansas City I could not walk at night safely. Certainly places you could not walk at night safely. I could probably walk safely, but I'd end up having to defend myself, and then I'd be in trouble for it. Another quote. I view cities, Thomas Jefferson, I view cities as pestilential to the morals, the health, and liberties of man. Is that not true?
Yes.
People in cities give up their liberties, Brenda.
Oh, I know
They do. If we look at this state, every time Kansas City and St. Louis votes against the morals of this state, they vote Democrat, and every other county votes Republican. They are given away their freedoms and don't even care that they've given away. They become dependent upon the government to meet their needs. And the government has no way to do anything except taking money from us.
Yep.
I want you to listen to that again. I view cities as pestilential to the morals, the health, and the liberties of man. Last quote. I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. He wrote that in a letter to Dr. Benjamin Russ on September 23rd, 1800, and I put that quote on my wall. I like it so well. We're allowing the government, talk about conflict, we're allowing the government to rule our lives. Literally.
Yeah.
I talked to my brother today, and he said, well, Max, he said, there's case law to support it. I said, case law doesn't mean it's constitutional. It's not constitutional, and I'm not doing it. I have a right not to, a God-given right. It puts me in conflict with my own government because they're letting case law rule the legal ramifications of forcing people to get a vaccine. Of course, they never tested it. They've never. It's not a vaccine. It's a gene therapy shot. All Johnson & Johnson is a vaccine, adenovirus delivered antigen. I don't know. We're in the most unusual time in the history of this nation. As we talk today, my brother and I, you cannot recognize this country from when we grew up in the 50s and 60s. You cannot recognize it. The people I grew up with and around were World War II veterans, and they wouldn't have stood for it.
No.
They would not have stood for it. World War II and Korean War veterans, and they would not have stood for it. And yet we have a generation that just bows down and says, let me have it. Whatever you desire. Terrible thing.
Yeah.
There are times when conflict is healthy. There are times when conflict is right. Right there's one of them. When tyranny raises its ugly snake head, we're to stomp it, like Christ stomped the serpent in the Garden of Gethsemane. There are times when we have to stand up for our rights. Stand up for what is right, what is moral, what is Christian, and support God in His efforts. Conflict's going to be with us all the time. You think there wasn't conflict between Christ and Satan? There wasn't conflict between Christ and the Pharisees? Between Christ and His own family? There was. Conflict is not something you can just wish away. We're going to be faced with conflict, and we have to make a decision. Are we going to stand for what's right, or are we going to simply back off so that we don't have to have any conflict?
Or throw the incense in.
Yeah.
And just...
Like the Christians in the Apostle Paul's time, they were just demanded, as we studied here, all you got to do is take a little pinch of incense, throw it in the altar, and just simply say where everybody can hear you, Caesar is Lord, and we'll leave you alone.
Cross your fingers behind your back if you want to, but...
And they wouldn't do it.
No, they wouldn't do it.
Were they in conflict with their government?
Absolutely.
Were they martyred for their belief?
That was the hill they chose to die on.
Were they kicked out of their guilds and their unions? Couldn't make a living cast out into the world because they would not put the incense in the altar and say, Caesar is Lord. I didn't like this lesson very good, but as I got into it and as the lesson writer approached it, I began to like it a lot more. How in some cases, we should embrace conflict. Do you know that? In the cases where we're standing up for our rights, when we're standing up for our liberty, we're standing against tyranny, where did he say, I've sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. That's one of our founding fathers. That's somebody you can use as an example. That's somebody that says there's a time for conflict. It's also Thomas Jefferson said, the blood of tyrants and patriots must be shed from time to time to maintain freedom. We may be getting close to that.
Well, I pray not. I have grandchildren.
So did all the Revolutionary War people have
Yes,
grandchildren.
I know that.
And they decided the sacrifice was worth it. There was conflict between us and the crown, and we wanted freedom. We didn't want anybody to tell us what to do, how to live, what we could and could not do. As Thomas Jefferson wrote, the author of the Declaration of Independence, these are God-given rights. They're not government-given rights. If they're God-given rights, the government sure can't take them.
Yep.
So thinking about that as we close our lesson today, there are times we should embrace conflict, and there are times we should avoid it. And as the Apostle Paul says, esteem others higher than oneself. See you next week.